The last section of notes forever. So for this last section of notes, we're going to talk about presidents from about 1964 through about, well, today, 2015. So we're going to start with Lyndon Johnson. I know we've talked about Lyndon Johnson with many of his civil rights laws. We haven't really talked much about his other policies. His domestic policy when he ran for president was called the Great Society. And during his presidency, he instituted programs or got programs passed like Medicare and Medicaid, which are still around today, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is now a new cabinet position, were established. And we've talked about his issues with Vietnam and how he escalated our military involvement there into a full-blown war. And because of those policies, he really lacked support from his own political party and from the American public. And so instead of running for re-election in 1968, he will decide not to run for re-election. Richard Nixon will win the next election in 1968 by a landslide over Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate. And so he becomes the next president. And we've talked about how he kind of, even though he campaigned on ending the Vietnam War, he kind of escalated still by bombing Cambodia and Laos. He also had some other big moments. For example, he became the first president to meet with a Soviet leader in the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, and they worked out a arms deal, meaning a reduction of arms called the SALT treaties. But probably his most famous moment, if you will, or infamous moment, happened in 1972. This is after his re-election as president, again winning in a landslide. But on June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested while breaking into the Democratic National Committee's offices in a hotel in Washington, D.C. called the Watergate. Now, he denied any involvement by he or his administration. But 2 Washington Post reporters who had a person from inside the administration reveal information that implicated President Nixon and that he was trying to cover up the Watergate break-in. And it involved tapes, and he had recorded all his conversations on tape. And when Congress found out that he had recorded conversations, they asked for the tapes. Nixon refused to give them. And then Congress got a subpoena, and Nixon gave up the tapes, where it clearly showed that he was covering up the Watergate scandal. So, of course, impeachment proceedings start to happen. But before an impeachment came down, Richard Nixon chose to resign from office on August 8th, 1974, becoming the first president to resign from office. Now, when President Nixon stepped down, his vice president, who just became vice president because the former vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned because of the Watergate scandal. So Gerald Ford was only newly sworn in as vice president, and now he's the new president. And he is the only president in our history who has held office without actually being elected, because he's replacing Nixon, and then he will lose his election bid in 1976. And part of the reason why he lost in 1976 was he granted a full pardon, presidential pardon, for Nixon in his role in Watergate, and that lost him a lot of support. Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia, who was also their governor, will defeat Gerald Ford in the 1976 election, mainly because people were dissatisfied with government in the previous administration. So that's why he kind of won. But during his 4-year term, lots of eventful things happened. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and as a form of protest, Jimmy Carter decided to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympic Games, which were held in Moscow, the Soviet Union. Of course, that will hurt the athletes. The athletes didn't want to boycott, but Jimmy Carter felt that it was important to show that the United States and all their Western allies would not put up with the Soviet Union's antics, if you will. Also, during his presidency, he helped two warring nations who have been at odds with each other for years come to peace, and that would be Israel and Egypt. And both countries, with the help of Jimmy Carter, will sign the Camp David Accords. So what you see in this picture here, the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, and then Jimmy Carter in the middle. A historic peace treaty. Then on November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students attacked the United States Embassy in the capital of Tehran of Iran, and they seized 90 American hostages in something that's now called the Iranian hostage crisis. That lasted over a year, and it actually ended on the night that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. So Ronald Reagan wins in a huge landslide over Jimmy Carter in 1980. And again, kind of following the rhetoric of all the other presidents of trying to contain communism, he would do it whatever he could to send aid to countries who are struggling with this. So he sent aid to anti-communist groups in the countries of El Salvador and Nicaragua, who had already kind of succumbed to some communist-leaning governments. And so he was looking to help groups who were rebelling against those governments, like a group called the Contras in Nicaragua. He also invaded places like Grenada, which was an island country. The Soviets were invading that. And Panama, to arrest the Panamanian leader, Manuel Noriega, a big drug transporter. And he also signed a treaty with our hated enemy, the Soviet Union, and their new premier, Mikhail Gorbachev. And they signed something called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned all mid-range or intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe. A scandal will break out during Reagan's presidency as well, called the Iran-Contra affair. And part of this is that Congress had banned the United States from sending any more aid to the Contras. Well, in this arms deal that took place, the United States sold arms to Iran, one of our enemies, and Iran would then send money to either the United States or to Nicaragua, and we would send money to Nicaragua or the arms. Now, the president was implicated, or was not tied to any of the scandal, but members of his high military command, like Oliver North, were charged with lying to Congress about the actions of the Iran-Contra affair. Ronald Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, will become the new president in 1988, or elected in 1988. And at the onset of his presidency, the Cold War will really officially end when the Soviet Union will break up. Many democratic-leaning revolutions were happening in the Soviet Union, so much so that those states that we consider part of the Soviet Union started to break away from the motherland, if you will, and all the other satellite countries of the Soviet Union, like Yugoslavia and Romania and Czechoslovakia, were having their own revolutions to remove communist governments. So the Cold War was really ending there. Also during Bush's presidency, a man named Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq, invaded the teeny tiny country of Kuwait, which is right here in the green. Here's Iraq. Here's Kuwait. They invade. The United States, under Bush, will organize a coalition of other nations to invade Iraq and free Kuwait. This became known as the Persian Gulf War. In 1992, Bill Clinton will win election over Bush. And one of the main issues during the 90s under President Clinton was terrorism. various incidences happened to American facilities around the world during the 1990s in Clinton. One was actually in our own country with a federal building called the Alfred Murrah Building in Oklahoma City. A homegrown terrorist will bomb it, killing hundreds of people inside, including children that were inside that building, as you can see in this picture here. And in his second term of office, President Clinton was only the second president to be impeached, the third to have proceedings set against him, but the second to be impeached for lying about a relationship that he had that wasn't his wife. And he was impeached by the House of Representatives, but he was found not guilty by the Senate, so he remained president. George W. Bush is elected in 2000 in a very controversial election between himself and the Vice President Al Gore. It was one of the closest presidential elections in history. Just by looking at this map here, you can kind of see that George Bush had 271 electoral votes, Al Gore had 266, and what pushed Bush over that threshold was Florida. It was a kind of a controversial state who used ballots, kind of the old-timey ballots, but you punch a hole in it. If you've ever gone to a baseball game where you had to have an all-star ballot and you had to punch the little holes in it, and if you look behind it, there are these little hanging things. These became known as hanging chads. And so in Florida, there's these hanging chads. And what was so controversial about that is that sometimes people thought by putting it into the ballot box, those chads would get shoved back up into the hole. And so Al Gore believed that many of his votes in Florida didn't count because the hanging chads got pushed back up. Anyway, the Supreme Court had to end this dispute and just said that George Bush would become the new president. And soon in office, terrorists again will attack the United States by hitting the World Trade Center, I should say, and the Pentagon, and another one that crashed in Pennsylvania on September 11, 2001. As a response to these attacks, George Bush will start bombing Afghanistan in 2001, looking for Osama bin Laden, who was considered the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. And in 2003, he will invade Iraq, looking for weapons of mass destruction that he believes Saddam Hussein was holding in that country and harboring terrorists. And finally, we have the current president, Barack Obama, who was elected in 2008. Significant because he is the first African American to become president of the United States. Some of the things that have happened so far: he found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan and had him eliminated. And he's also dealt with issues in our country dealing with our economy. When he became president in 2008, the economy was on a slippery slope to a depression, or at least it was a really bad recession, but it was kind of leaning toward a depression, and healthcare issues in our country. That's it. You're finished. Congratulations.